go. Audio is working, video is working, chat is working. Let's take a look at what's up for the day. So, at the end of the previous video, I had run a Farsyte D/1 mission where all I did was take the top bit of the craft we're building and I put it out on the launch pad, and we got some science. We verified that we could move science in manually. And I thought it might be really cool to automate that process. So I did a little bit of research and things look pretty good. I see ways of triggering the science, which I've looked at. I haven't looked yet at how to automatically move the science in, but it looks like we might be able to do this. So let's get to thinking about this whole mission we want to do. So my requirements are: I want to be able to carry a tourist, I want to be able to collect science and get it down, I want my launch to get to space and to circularize the orbit and to deorbit and land safely. And the proper way of planning this out is to start from the end of the mission and work backwards. So we build a stage at each level that can carry the previous stage up through the mission. The downside is I don't currently have a way of getting good numbers. I don't know how much fuel I need to deorbit. So we're still going to end up guessing at a lot of this and trying it and changing things, and hopefully with the automatic staging and so on, we won't need to worry too much about changing our scripting as we change the thing. So landing safely, we're going to need, I'm going to put a checklist here of things to be sure I put on the thing. We're going to need a parachute. And I'm going to, I don't know whether VS Code does this or not, but under Emacs you can set these up as checklists, and there's keystrokes to make it check off and so on. I am trying to learn how to use VS Code, and people keep telling me VS Code is great. I'm an old Emacs guy. So obviously I'm going to find things that I can do in Emacs that I can't do in VS Code. Either can't do it all or can't do yet. I'm hoping that by using VS Code I can learn those things, and I can find the things that people like to do in VS Code that are difficult in Emacs. The first thing I found was this integration with GitHub and GitLens and so on, all these add-ons. Fairly hard to get that set up under Emacs. I haven't seen great GitHub integrations that can do things like allow me to set up an issue like that. So far, as a professional coding tool, I see things here that maybe normally when I use Emacs I would go out to other tools to do, which I have no objection to doing, but having it right there in the editor, I could see how people like that. So let's go back to here. What do we need? We need a parachute. Obviously the parachute's going to handle the last little bit. Above that, we need a heat shield. Okay, and I'm going to put it above that. Well, I'm trying to arrange this checklist so it'll be from the bottom of the rocket to the top of the rocket in that order. And that may not be the best way to do it. Let's put this top to bottom. And I'm going to change all of these. So I think I could do Control F2 to change all. That changed all the stars to a dash. That wasn't really what I wanted. So here's the requirements. We'll work from the top of the rocket down. So we've got a parachute on top. We need a heat shield. We need a crew cabin. And either I need to commit to carrying a tourist and a Kerbal, or I need to commit to having a unmanned core and a tourist. And I think the best way is to have two. So we'll have a crew cabin for pilot and tourist. We already know we have one that could do that. We found that. We need a heat shield. The heat shield is actually built in to the cabin I'm going to select, which is great. We'll just check those off together. So below that I have separator. These are all built into the command capsule. So those are all built into that one command capsule. I've forgotten what it's called. So once we've got that, then we need science. We need science storage. And we need science experiments. Now the storage is going to have to be with the capsule. And we're going to clip that inside because otherwise it's just this big honking thing sitting out there. Science storage is not a physical cabinet, it's data storage. So we'll just assume that they're putting a black box somewhere in that onion capsule. Maybe Jeb is carrying it on his lap. So we got science storage and science experiments that are hanging down below the separator. That's cool. So now we need engines and for deceleration. So I'm going to do two things here. I want to deorbit from our circular orbit, and then I want to do a separate deceleration burn at some point on the way down, because I don't trust just falling from orbit and assuming that it's going to be okay. So we'll figure out where that happens. So working backwards in time, before we deorbit, we're sitting there on orbit. We need ability to do EVA, and we need gathering of science. I will probably spend quite a bit of time working out how to automatically gather science. Like I said, I would love to be able to automatically grab science as we went from biome to biome. And I don't know whether the crew reports are changing from biome to biome, but I know that the EVA reports do. I do not expect that kOS will be able to send the pilot on an EVA, grab an EVA report, bring him back into the capsule. I also don't expect that with the pilot outside, kOS will be able to tell the pilot to take EVA and put it in. So this gathering of science may be a manual thing. Probably a automatic gathering of science for the experiments. Now, at some point before we do the separation, we want to transfer science to storage. I'm going to call the parachute part of the command capsule, even though it's, well, no, let's... If we're doing it top down, my plan is, as we built last time, to have the crew cabin, put the storage module on top of it, and then slide it in, and then put the parachute on top of the storage module, so it all looks like it was built that way on purpose. So if we were to turn this into a checklist, we'd be working our way up from the bottom as we executed things. Given that, should we perhaps write this list from the bottom to the top? So this is where it comes in handy for me to go into Emacs. I don't have any confidence in being able to, in VS Code under Windows, shuffle it off into a command running in the Linux environment. So we go over to Emacs. Farsyte has a log.org file. Rev doesn't do what I thought it did. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some keyboard macros to do this manually because I'm a Goomba. So we go change windows, go back over here, go up one, like that. And of course, there we go. And I managed to do that without reversing a single line. So we go over there, grab that one, put it there, and we want that one to be at the top, so we're done. No, we're not. So there's our order reversed. So if we do this in time order, it is gather science, do EVA, deorbit, decelerate. Then we should see the science experiments and be able to transfer science to storage. We don't really need to have that there. Oh no. Science experiments present, transfer science to storage. Then we have the command capsule, which has separator, heat shield, and crew cabin, and above that is storage, and above that is parachute. Okay, now back to VS Code. So we're on orbit, and we are about to do gathering of science. What did we do just before that? Well, the only thing we really need to do before that is circularize. Before we circularize, we need to coast to apoapsis. So we coast to coast to the apoapsis, and then we circularize the orbit, and so on. Well, before that, we send along a pitch program. I'm not going to call it a gravity turn because we're not actually doing a real gravity turn. That would be starting at an initial slight angle and then just always firing prograde, actually always just firing forward, and then you let the aerodynamic forces hold you. And your path curves over by gravity, and as your path curves over, the rocket is held in place by aerodynamic forces. This is the way you do a rocket that has no guiding whatsoever, a sounding rocket. I believe the Japanese launched this way, or launched this way for a long time, because they felt that doing the closed loop control systems to control a rocket launch like this is perilously close to building offensive weapons, which Japanese don't like to do. Or didn't like to do. It's in their constitution after World War II. Interesting way that history impacts science. It comes up with a really cool thing, which is you put the rocket in place and it fires off without any technological things controlling how it moves. It just flies. All you're doing is thrusting in the direction you're pointed. And there you go. Anyway, that would be a true gravity turn. What we're doing is we actually have a pitch program where we are selecting Based on our altitude, we're selecting what pitch we want to thrust at. Okay, so part of this is I want to gather information along the way on altitude, pitch, and velocity, well, speed. So we're going to do ground speed, altitude, ground speed, and pitch angle, commanded pitch angle. I may add more things later. So start gathering telemetry. Once we have ascended along the pitch program, assure telemetry is uplinked, is downlinked, is archived. Let's just say archived. Uplink and downlink are well defined when you're standing on the ground watching a rocket above you. They're not so well defined when you've got a embedded system that is receiving and sending data. What if you're talking to another system? Are you uplinking the data to another embedded system, or are you downlinking it from the downlinking it to the other system? So we're going to talk about archiving. We're going to talk about transmitting and receiving data. We're going to try to avoid using the words up and down. So I think that I can periodically copy my telemetry data file back to the ground. So as I gather it, periodically it goes to the ground. So whenever we lose our radio link, we'll be done. We'll maintain this file, and what I'm going to do is have a notion of, do I have dirty data? So maybe we will need to modify the storage. So that's another thing to do. So Farkos :st returns true if file is copied. So there's some refactoring we need to do. If I were doing this for a real spacecraft mission, I would probably open up a branch in my Git repository to work on telemetry storage. That's kind of a major thing. We have the pitch program, we have kOS apoapsis, we have circularize. These are all things that work. We haven't tested circularize yet in this save, but I know the code works because it's unmodified in the last 5-7 years. Gathering of science, we need to look at what we can do to automate it. So the question is, do I want to start right off with doing the heavyweight software engineering where I start opening issues and making branches? The professional engineer in me is saying yes. The retired software hobbyist in me is saying I'm only working on one thing at a time. Get real. So we're going to just do this straight in line. I'm going to work on telemetry first. I'm going to get that done before I even start thinking about any other code changes. So for now, the gathering of science is going to be manual. The transfer is going to be manual. We'll automate that later. So that covers our gathering of telemetry during ascent. In fact, we can let this just continue running as we go. Fields. Mission time. So we know what time it is. We want altitude. I had some problems earlier when I tried to explicitly use radar altitude, and I just wanted to use altitude. I'll use the number it calls altitude, whatever that is. I'm not sure whether that's always going to be radar altitude or always going to be not radar altitude, but that's what I'll log. So we want our altitude, we want our speed, I'm going to say airspeed. No, let's call it ground speed. So the ground track speed is going to be important below a certain altitude. And at some point above a certain altitude, it's going to be orbital speed. So I'm going to have a flag in here as to whether I'm talking about ground or orbital things. And there's a standard altitude in KSP where it transitions, and we'll see the nav ball make that change. I think I need to look that up. KSP, so I'm not showing my browser for other reasons, but KSP, kOS, nav ball, orbit versus ground. Nav ball surface mode versus orbit mode. Found an article. And there's a link to the wiki. I love it. Markers. You know, in the answer to that question, they linked to the nav ball entry in the wiki. And I don't see point of reference. Point of reference is service, orbit, and target. Does it not automatically change? The modes switch automatically at certain distances. Okay, so none of the answers say at what altitude it changes, or what speed it changes, or what else it automatically changes. Yeah, I'm not seeing any answers. So what I will do is I will initially use my ground velocity in all my logging, because we're still going to be near Kerbin, so it's not going to be that different. Now let's use ground speed and orbit speed. Commanded pitch. So we're going to log the pitch that we want to command. So this is the telemetry for the ascent. So time, altitude, commanded pitch, and ground speed. So ascent, phase, fields. So what we want to store is mission time and phase. I think that as we I'll store the ascent stuff for now. We'll come back later to revise the telemetry gathering so that we can sanely have the data we want for ascent, have the data we want for deorbiting, which I'm going to want similar data for deorbiting, time, altitude, and speed, of course. Well, heck, why not? Time, altitude, velocity, vector. I believe we have 2 of those available. So mission elapsed time, universal time. The nice thing about gathering data like this is, unless it gets too big, I can gather as much as I want. Oh, no. So, mission elapsed seconds. Let's keep it small, because starting with this flight, we're going to be packing in 10 kilobytes. So we're going to log mission elapsed seconds. We're going to log altitude in meters. We're going to log commanded pitch. This is going to be specifically an ascent phase log. So to keep the logs small, I'm going to focus them narrowly on what data I need for that phase of the operation. We're going to log during that phase of the operation, and then we're going to stop logging and work out some way of transferring the data when we have a connection. I think actually I'm running this with always have connection, so that's maybe something we turn off at some point, but that's yeah, we will turn that off eventually, but let's just make this work for now. So the descent phase will start gathering telemetry. So we will need to now potentially I could have Farsyte delete the file when it stores it. No, that would break set stage. So just return true if the file is copied. We can delete the file if we see that it's true and we want to delete it. So there's our bit of coding we need to do. Launch phase through clearing the gantry. We want the launch phase to move us upwards without changing our attitude in any way until we are free to maneuver. And if we start pitching over too soon, we might knock things around in KSP. So launch phase through clearing the gantry. We have this working. So we've got our checklist down here. We've got things we need to build. We've got code we need to write. Now, working up here, we didn't put in any engines or fuel other than this. So we've got deorbit, deceleration, for circularizing orbit, for circularize. And before we launch, we need to have engines and fuel for launch, through, and descent. So we know this needs to be 2,000 meters per second, approximately. I do not know what my costs are going to be for circularize. That depends on what our periapsis is. And I haven't written the math to compute delta V requirements on the periapsis in a very long time. I'm not going to do that live coding. That's... Oh, wait a minute. Do I have my orbital? I might have my orbital notes from way back when. I have always been fascinated by spaceflight. Mirror. I have a lot of files that I have maintained over the years. Okay, so looking at all of the tech files I've had around, there's all of my Kalman filter stuff. Ah, there it is. The old Ephemeris project has orbital notes, which has PDFs, selected equations from this, that, and the other. Orbital notes.pdf. There we go. I have no idea if this is even going to be visible, but let's see here. So back in 2014, when I worked at NASA, I gathered all of these formulas together because I was having too much fun learning. I didn't actually have to know about this for my job, even though I was working on spacecraft flight software. I was working on infrastructure stuff, but I really wanted to figure out what mathematical equations actually governed the way spacecraft work. And you can see I wrote a whole bunch of notes. So we started off with, what are our key equations? And I'm going to have to read this to remind myself, because that's been 8 years ago. Gravity, the harmonic law, which relates the period of an orbit to its semi-major axis, and nothing else. The vis viva law, which shows you, it relates your velocity to the semi-major axis of the orbit and your current radius. Now, the way that works is that your gravitational potential energy and your kinetic energy are always going to add up to be a constant, because as you move through the gravitational field, you are neither gaining nor losing energy. Okay? So when you're at your apoapsis, you have the minimum kinetic energy and the maximum gravitational potential energy. And you're still moving, hopefully. And at some point you come down and you come close. So at any point along there, if you know your distance and you know your total energy, which is a constant here, which you can calculate, then you can figure your velocity. So this says v squared over mu is equal to 2 over r minus 1 over a. And there's a lot of math behind that, which we can ignore because we are just going to do what is now called in scientific circles, shut up and calculate. Okay. Oops. Elliptical orbits. This is not actually a closed form solution in terms of time, but r equals p over 1 plus e cos f is the formula. Kepler's equation for the elliptical case has all sorts of interesting things. And then deep inside a reference I have here noted as CP93 is the universal formulation of Kepler's equations, which works for elliptical, circular, parabolic, and hyperbolic trajectories. Pretty cool. Unfortunately, it involves a lot of extra math. So this is the kind of thing that you do once and you code up and you bottle away in a library. There are certain quantities that people consistently use consistent labels for. So I wanted to get some nice clean figures. So for instance, if you have the center of the gravitational field here where this P and Q come together, I'm hoping that you got a big enough screen to see this. We can see that A is the semi-major axis. It's the difference between its distance from the center of the ellipse not the focus, the center, to the periapsis and the apoapsis. And this is cut short because I really wanted to show this much of it. So A is the half of the semi-major axis. B is half the semi-minor axis. Similarly, Q is your radius at the apoapsis, and P, which they call that the semilatus rectum. So it's half the distance across this line, rectum right. So take this, take a right angle. This is the semilatus. This is the latus rectum. This is the semilatus rectum. So P and Q are interesting things. So if you start out here at your periapsis and you go until you are 90 degrees around the center of the thing, you're going to be at altitude P, which is not the farthest. So, new set of things, the true anomaly is, how do you describe this? I haven't drawn enough of it. I will have to look at the math to see how that comes up. But the true anomaly is an angle based at the center of gravity, or the primary focus. The mean anomaly is an angle centered at the center of the ellipse, this point here. And you start dealing with only this outer dotted line. The eccentric anomaly, again, is an angle. It's an angle on this outer circle where you drop a perpendicular to this semi-major axis to find the point on the ellipse. So point on the ellipse, you go away from the axis until you hit the circle, and you come back, and this is the angle. And sub-zero tends to be a start of a period, and no sub at all is current. So this is, if we had F0 and F, there would be T0, and there's another label out there that's not shown. Math gets interesting. Glossary of terms, which I'm going to have to read to remind myself of these things. This algorithm, Laguerre algorithm, are ways of doing numerical integrations. Symbols. Starting here is where I turned it all into Python. And obviously in Python you don't have square roots and hats and dots and so on. So I gave them all names, which I locked down on, and I will use these names, because all of these useful equations that I've got are all written using the names. Now I'm going to have to do some translation to move this from Python or Lua. I did this in Python and then later did some Lua work with it as well. I'll have to translate this for kOS, or for there's no equal sign. You say set something to, and dot is v dot or multiply. But we have all of these formulas related. Elements of the orbit, prediction of orbits. And there's some subterms I wanted to prove the convergence of. What I was hoping was in here, I would be able to see the change in velocity as I have an orbit and I'm at the apoapsis. What's the change of velocity that I need to move the periapsis out to circular? So what I would have to do is figure my velocity, v, knowing my current radius, which is the apoapsis radius, and the semi-major axis. Well, that's an easy application of the initial equations we had here. Bada boom, bada boom. It's going to have things like 1 over r and 1 over a. Okay, I used alpha for 1 over a. A, B, eccentricity, angles. So I am solving for a velocity. So here's one part we're going to need. The VC, circular velocity, is this thing r mu, square root of mu divided by the square root of r0. So the circular velocity is easy to compute. So the other half we need is the velocity when we're not circular. That's escape velocity is VE. VQ is the velocity. Q is periapsis. So velocity at periapsis is 1 plus eccentricity times mu over h. And h, what is h? H is the angular momentum, which we have to compute. So it may be worthwhile to set up some Kerbal script to do this calculation for me, to figure out what my burn will be. It may be worthwhile. Or I could back of the envelope it, guess it as it would be. The 600 meters per second that I had and applied raised my periapsis from essentially the center radius up to very nearly there. So I may be very close to being able to circularize. So I'm going to guess at 1,000 meters per second, but we will do this math. Just not right now. So I guess at 1,000 meters per second. Deorbit is going to be circ delta v minus 600 meters per second. Because 600 meters per second was what we got to from our circularization up through where we want to be when we're done. So whatever we get here for proper circularization, we need 600 meters per second less to deorbit. Now for deceleration, not sure it's necessary, but let's carry, well, let's see if we can carry 400 meters per second of fuel for deceleration. So let's work our way up. Deceleration, deorbit, circularize, launch and ascent. So 2,000, 1,000, 400, and 400. So this means total of 2,000 for circularization followed by getting back home. I'm thinking a launch, call it, maybe give us some extra stuff there, 2,000, 2,500, who knows, and give us maybe 1,500 to 2,000 for the second half of it. So there's our engines planned. So now we can start building this thing. I am going to reduce the size of my editor here. And let's get the game going. So, Farkos D1. Here's where we left off. Let's work through our checklist from the bottom up. Do we have a parachute? We have a parachute. Do we have science storage? We have science storage. I'm going to work through this in Emacs so I can work through it in Emacs so I can actually do things like check things off. That's better. So, parachute, check. Science storage, check. Command console, which has